Hello again, Lakers. Uh, we're going to, in this video, take a look at single gene effects on social behaviors. So I will share my screen and we'll get rolling. Alrighty, we'll take a look at single gene influences on social behavior. So we're here in lecture 6 and we'll give you some examples. So we're thinking about how genetics plays a role in social behavior. And I said, are there examples of individual genes contributing to complex social behavior? And yes, there actually are. In our last lecture, we talked about pair bonding behavior in prairie voles. And researchers have discovered that there's a gene, the AVPR1A gene, that codes for a particular type of vasopressin receptor in the brains of prairie voles. And different versions of this gene contribute to differences in the expression of these receptors and differences in pair bonding behaviors in prairie voles. We've already examined this, and it's a pretty nice link. It's not the only gene that contributes to pair bonding formation or pair bonding strength in prairie vole males, but it's a pretty important one. The second gene down, another example is from our readings. So if you go to our Mother Nature textbook, you can read about the FOSB gene and how it contributes to nurturing behavior in mice. We're going to take a look at the MAOA gene and antisocial behavior in humans, and then this gene, the PPFOR gene, in a particular species of ants. So we'll start with the MAOA gene and antisocial behavior in humans. This gene has been relatively recently linked to what we might call antisocial behavior, or we might call it violence or abusive or aggressive behaviors. By definition, antisocial behavior is a failure to conform to the social norms for lawful behavior. We might say we saw some of this antisocial behavior on January 6th, a few years back. Behavior that is, violent. Researchers are looking into a particular gene called the MAOA gene. And this gene, the name of the gene is the monoamine oxidase A gene. This gene codes for a protein, but the protein is an enzyme. So let's fill in on this little blank here. I think I'm going to write in it's an enzyme. This gene codes for an enzyme that works in the brain, and it breaks down neurotransmitters in the brain. Neurotransmitters are simply chemicals that trigger or inhibit the transmission of nerve impulses at neurons in the brain or elsewhere, right? And you've probably heard of these neurotransmitters: serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. Those kinds of molecules are really important in the functioning of the nervous system and in the functioning of our neurons in our brain. And our brain tightly regulates the amount of each of these neurotransmitters in different parts of our brain. And they're involved in different, in contributing to our physiology and to our behavior. For example, norepinephrine, an increase in that activates our flight or fight response. So you've probably heard about these. Well, our brain is really good at regulating levels of neurotransmitters in our brain. And one of the reasons is we have this MAOA gene that is expressed in the brain, making an enzyme that helps to break down excess serotonin, excess dopamine, excess norepinephrine in various parts of the brain. If this gene isn't working properly, then there might not be perfect regulation of these neurotransmitters in the brain, and that can contribute to changes in our behavior. There might be a dysregulation of these neurotransmitters. Evidence for this comes from kind of an interesting study of a Dutch family that is worth describing for a second. So back in the late 1980s, 1990s, some women in a Dutch family went to a university and went to a researcher studying genetics and said, gosh, we have some weirdness going on in our family, especially among men in our family. There are some men that are crazily prone to violence. They're prone to reactive violence. Here's some examples of what they've done. We have one relative who's raped his sister. We have another who's gotten mad at his boss and run down the boss with his car. We've got another one who's committed arson. We've got another male relative who's forced sisters to undress at knife point, done these weird antisocial behaviors. And they thought, you know what? I wonder if there's some genetic basis for this antisocial behavior in our family. And so that was studied. And the researchers actually found a problem with the gene MAOA. This gene is located on the X chromosome, and the researchers of this Dutch family found out that the men in the family who had also had these unusual antisocial behaviors lacked a functional MAOA gene. It had a mutation that made the gene non-functional. The gene could not make the enzyme. So there was a serious dysregulation of these neurotransmitters in the brains of the men in this family. You might be asking, why were only men affected? Some of you biologists out there might have caught that I said this gene was located on the X chromosome. Males inherit one copy of the X chromosome. Females inherit 2 copies. If you only get 1 copy of the X chromosome and you have a mutation in your gene so that the gene doesn't work, you're not going to have a functional version of this gene anywhere. So we see that the Dutch men in this family were affected more than the women were. There was no evidence of the women. All right, so that was kind of early evidence that this gene is important and somehow contributes to violence. Other people have said, all right, well, let's take a look at this MAOA gene. Let's investigate it further. And they found out that this gene is complex. If you look at the gene, so let's just say that this is the MAOA gene. And here's the coding region that codes for this enzyme. Upstream of the coding region is what we call a promoter region. And researchers found some variation in the promoter region of different peoples. There's a part of the promoter region that's called a VNTR region, a variable number of tandem repeat region. What that basically means is in different people, you can have different versions of this gene where you've got a repeat that is repeated a different number of times in different people or in different versions of the gene. Some people only have 2 repeats, others have 3 repeats, others have 4 and 5. What researchers found, interestingly, is that individuals with low repeat numbers, and that would be what fits into that blank, with low repeat numbers of less than 3, have less activity of their gene. They have lower gene activity, which means they're going to have lower levels of this enzyme, and they're going to get a buildup of neurotransmitters in their brain. People with high repeat numbers, greater than 4, greater or equal to 4, have a higher active gene. The MAOA gene is more active. It produces more of the enzyme, and we see because of the higher levels of the enzyme, we see less buildup of the neurotransmitters in the brain. Interestingly, researchers started linking the low variant or the high variant, the low repeat or the high variant repeat, to behavior. And what they've shown is that individuals with the low repeat MAOA gene, the low activity gene, you could say, are more likely to be violent. They're more likely to join gangs. They're more likely to use weapons than individuals with high activity MAOA gene. Lots of studies on this. Here's one really interesting one that you guys, I think, like to hear about. It was done by researcher McDermott in 2009, and it goes something like this. They decided to study people with differences in their MAOA gene. So they found a bunch of volunteers. These are college students, most likely. I'm pretty sure they were 78 volunteers that showed a difference in their gene. They either had the low activity variant or the high activity variant. Most people in the study had the high activity variant. Something like 75% of people have the high activity variant, and 25% have the low activity variant. That's pretty consistent with the American population. Let me see. They also just chose to use males. Females have 2 copies of this gene. Males just have 1 copy of the gene, so it made it kind of easier. Anyway, they asked these participants to play a game. And here's how the game went. They told the participants, you're interacting with someone else in a different room on a computer. It wasn't really a person, but they didn't know that. And you're doing this vocabulary game. And the more answers you get right, the more money you make. And that's great. So you're working hard to make money, and you're kind of working together in some way. I can't figure that out. But at the end of the game, after you've done all the hard work, the person on the other side will get to take some money from you if they want to. They can take any amount of money, although in the study, the computer in the other room took either 20% of the total money made or 80%. They just stole a lot of that money. And the participants then, if they were upset, if the partner on the other side of in the other room stole most of their hard-earned money, they could punish them if they wanted to. And they punished them. They were told that they could punish these thieves by administering a hot sauce punishment, where every time they punished them, they could punish them with 1/8 of a teaspoon of hot sauce, and they had 10 teaspoons of hot sauce to administer during each round of this experiment. In the round, I think there were 4 rounds or something. So you could tell them, hey, I'm mad. Give that person 1/8 of a teaspoon. Give that person 2/8 of a teaspoon until you ran out of money, until you ran out of hot sauce. If you didn't use your hot sauce, you got some money back. You got extra money at the end of the game. And you earn money, of course, if you did well on the vocabulary test. So here's what they found. This first diagram is pretty straightforward. All right. So they lumped everyone together, all the volunteers in the study, and they showed that, look, depending on how much was taken from them, 20% or 80%, subjects, our college students, did get kind of mad. They ended up administering more punishment, more hot sauce, when more money was taken. So you can see when only 20% is taken, that's the light gray. Most people didn't even administer any punishments. But by the time 80% was taken, quite a few people said, gee, that bothered me. I'm going to punish you. Not everybody, though, for sure. But then here's what they decided to do. Let's look at the type of MAO gene that you have, the low activity type or the high activity type. Remember, the low activity type had been identified as correlated to violent behavior in the past. All right. And they said, let's look at these different subjects and let's separate out individuals who have the low active version of the gene or the high active version of the gene. And then let's also separate out when 20% is stolen or 80% of their money is stolen. And here's what they found. They were looking at how much did they punish? That's some evidence of violence, right? Or of being spiteful or whatever. And they found out that When only 20% of the money was taken, there was no difference between individuals who had the low active version of the gene or the high active version of the gene. No difference. All right. Most people didn't administer any punishment and it went down kind of, most people, um, it didn't bother them much, right? And there were no differences between our two groups of males. Then they looked at a situation in which 80% of the money was stolen by their so-called partner. And it turns out that that had a bigger effect. Individuals who had the low activity gene were more likely to administer more sauce than individuals who more of the hot sauce, more of the punishment than individuals who had the high version of the gene. The data here look weird because we're looking at frequencies, and remember, there were just way more individuals who have the high version of the gene. So they're looking at numbers of individuals. But the basic thing to look at, what I want you to look at is this category. Look at the light gray. Look at the light gray bars first over here. Look at all the light gray bars. And notice that you have a lot of them over on this end, not much punishment. But if you look at the black bars, you see, over here, lots of people who have the low activity version of this gene administered as much punishment as they could. We might just call that acting out of spite. Like, oh, I'm mad at that guy. I'm just going to make him eat some hot sauce. We would call this a gene by environment interaction, because when there's not much money taken, when there was not much provocation, let's just say, or maybe when the players were not all that frustrated, they didn't act differently. But when the players did get more frustrated, when there was more provocation, the individuals who have the low activity version of the gene were much more reactive. They punished at higher rates. We would call that a gene by environment interaction. And that's what researchers have settled on. They say, you know what? People with this lower activity version of the gene might just have higher thresholds for violent behavior. They're overly sensitive or reactive to threats or challenges that other people might just shrug off. Other people might go, whatever, no big deal. It's just a dumb game. It was $5 one way or the other. People with the low activity version might get more frustrated by that and might act on it more quickly. Does that make sense? It's kind of an interesting example. There's more to this example. It goes on and on. Researchers started calling this the warrior gene. And they started looking at societies that they thought were like, oh, these are warrior societies. These are societies in which warfare has been really important, and there's been a lot of it. And in my head, I'm like, isn't that all societies? Think about it for a minute. Like, every culture I can think of has had lots of war. But anyway, researchers found, for example, that as a whole, about 30% of the population across the world has this low activity variant of the gene. But when you look at some warrior cultures like the Maori of New Zealand, who are, stereotyped as being a very warlike culture, the percent of individuals with the low activity variant goes way up. It's like, 56% of Maori males have this version. Whoa. The problem with this is, by calling the gene a warrior gene, one, it isn't a warrior gene. It might, under certain situations, lead to the expression of more violence, but it's certainly not a warrior gene. But if you label it as such, it really can reinforce racial stereotyping, and so easy to be used in the wrong way. We don't want to just say, oh, this gene causes this behavior, because the link is obviously more complex. And there's a lot of evidence for these gene by environment interactions. A long-term study done in New Zealand, looking at males over a 30-year period. We're looking at males with low activity variants and high activity variants of the gene. And they found out that, sure enough, males with low activity variants of the gene were more likely, no, let me rephrase. I'm sorry, let me say that again. Individuals with low activity versions of the gene and high activity versions of the gene did differ in their criminality. So they were looking at who's in jail 30 years after they started this experiment, who ends up in jail. But the interesting thing was they found out that people were more likely to be criminals or to be in jail because of violent offenses only if two things. They had abuse in early childhood of some type, some sort of trauma or abuse in their childhood, and they have the low MAOA variant. So it looked like there was this like link. You had to have kind of a combination of childhood trauma, abuse, and the low activity version of the gene to kind of show up as being more likely to be a violent criminal in your future. So there's an interesting relationship there that your past experiences and your genetic makeup may in fact contribute to your inability or your inability to function well in society in this case, right? Okay, couple other things. The MAOA gene is located on the X chromosome. How does that explain why more males show antisocial behavior than females? Can it? Females inherit 2 copies of every of the X chromosome. Chromosomal males inherit 1 copy of the X chromosome and 1 small Y chromosome. The gene is located on the X chromosome. So they inherit these 2 large X. I should have drawn them more like little sticks. 2 large X chromosomes. Males inherit 1 large X and 1 little dinky Y. The gene is on the X chromosome. So if a female inherits a low variant form of the gene, they also inherit a high variant. They may also inherit the high variant form of the gene. They get 2 chances to inherit the high variant form of the gene. Males, on the other hand, only have 1 chance. They only have 1 copy of this gene. Whatever copy they have, they express. And so if they have the low activity version of the gene, they express it. They are more likely to show this behavior. It's much like it's a sex-linked gene. It's an X-linked gene. There are lots of X-linked traits that you might be more familiar with, like colorblindness. Males are much more likely to be colorblind because the genes for color vision are located on the X chromosome, and males only have to inherit 1 copy of a mutant gene to show colorblindness. Females would have to inherit 2. All right. And then the last question, that is something that I'm not going to answer, but it's something to think about. Why is there variation in this gene? Could different versions of the gene be selected for in different populations or in different circumstances? Is it possible that being more reactive or more sensitive to trauma or to trauma or to abuse or to the environment around you, to threats or to challenges, could that be selected for under some situations? Could it be selected? Could having lower reactivity to threats and challenges be selected for in other situations? You have to think about that. In other words, did natural selection, or has it acted in the past so that we have this kind of variation in I don't know. Here's a second example in ants. So we got to get some animal example. The PPFOR gene, I call it the P4 gene in ants, is kind of an interesting one. So in a particular species, this Pheidole pallidula ant, this is a picture that actually shows the queen. The queen ant here is the reproducer. And then here is a soldier. We call them the majors. And then a smaller foraging ant called the minors. There's 3 different castes, if you will. The queen does all the reproducing. The majors have these really giant mandibles that are great for fighting. So they're doing most of the defense in the colony. And these little guys, the foragers, are going out to find prey and to drag it back home so that they can feed the rest of the colony. They're also doing all the work and all the other work. All right. So we have these different distinct morphologies and behaviors. We have majors, besides the queen, we have majors, and we have these minors that are doing more of the foraging. Now, researchers have found that there's this gene that codes, this PP4 gene, that codes for an enzyme called a kinase enzyme. There are lots and lots of kinase enzymes out there. This particular one, we won't worry about the details, but this gene codes for an enzyme, a kinase enzyme, that somehow mediates the shift or change in worker behaviors. These workers can sometimes be flexible in their behaviors, particularly the majors. The defenders can sometimes become foragers. And so researchers started looking at the role of this gene in contributing to flexibility in workers, in the ants. And they did lots of research, and these are really complex, so we'll try to sort them out a second. These little graphs aren't really that hard, but we'll figure it out. What they looked at was they looked at PKG activity. That's the activity of this gene, all right? This is the enzyme. How active is the enzyme? The gene is being expressed, the gene is being less expressed, right? And then they looked at, so that's what they've got on here on the y-axis. And then they looked across the different colonies. They used 3 different colonies, but then they compared majors to minors. And they found that majors, the defenders, are produce and have much more of this enzyme active than do the foragers, the minors, shown in green here. In other words, there's this nice correlation between amount of the enzyme and worker behavioral state. So the correlation is an increase in PKG, and that's associated with being a defender or being a major, okay? And the minors or foragers are associated with having less of this enzyme. This gene is less active. Part 2. Then they presented both majors and minors with 2 potential prey. One is a control plastic worm, and one is a real mealworm. So the control is when there's not a real living prey item to be had. And the worm would be the real live mealworm. And you've got majors shown in purple, minors shown in green, and they looked at PKG activity. They said, all right, what's going on? And what they found was that majors, let's go back. What they found with minors is that when the worm is present, the PKG activity is lower. When they're actually foraging, when they're actually going for the real mealworm, their PKG levels go down compared to the control. But they also found that with majors. When majors were given this big mealworm to deal with, they also responded and they behaved by foraging, and also their PKG levels went down. There's a relationship. When the majors were foraging, PKG levels are down. So let's fill in this blank. Majors can be recruited to help with foraging, and PKG levels decrease in foraging majors. There's definitely this relationship going on. Then they did part 3, in which they presented majors and minors with a nestmate and with a stranger, an alien, they call it. And they try to figure out what happens when there's an alien present. The nestmate is the control, all right? So when you can look across the board, there's significant effects. That's what those little asterisks mean. There's significant effects across the board, but we're looking again still at PKG activity. We find out that when there is, when there's a stranger, when there's an alien to defend your nest from, PKG levels skyrocket in our majors. And they actually increase in the minors too. So PKG levels increase when minors and majors are exposed to aliens. So you've got an alien intruding, you're going to increase your PKG activity, and that's associated with being able to defend better somehow, or the acts of defense. Researchers also decided, hey, let's mess with PKG levels pharmacologically. Let's like change their PKG levels. And they did this. And this diagram is actually a bit confusing to me, but we'll go with it. So they presented either a foraging stimulus like a mealworm, right, or an alien. And they had two groups. They have the majors and the minors again from each colony, but also they have a control versus what's called the cyclic GMP. The cyclic GMP is increases of our enzyme. So they're either going to do a control, or they're going to increase the enzyme. If you increase the enzyme, I'm assuming there's going to be more fighting, less foraging behavior, because that's what we've seen in the other studies. And so let's take a look. When we're looking at the majors for these three colonies, we're looking at the workers interacting with the worm, or workers interacting with the ant, okay, the alien ant. And what we see is the control majors, the ones who weren't given PKG doses, extra PKG doses, PKG doses. These guys will go forage for, these control guys will go foraging. These guys here are much less likely to forage. That's actually the same is true with minors. In the defense, though, it's kind of interesting. In terms of defending, the control animals will defend. They should. They're majors. But the ones that were amped up on PKG, they're all defending. They're like, we see an alien, we're defending. The minors, interestingly enough, when they were amped up on PKG, they didn't change their behavior. They're like, yeah, some of us will defend here and there, but we're not going out there. So it didn't affect them in the same way as it did the majors. Interesting that this gene produces an enzyme that can change. This gene's activity can change, and as this gene's activity changes, it can lead to changes in the behavior of particularly the majors, but also the minors, these ants. It gives them flexibility in what they need to do out in the wild, whether they need to defend or whether they need to forage. So there's this nice connection between a gene and a behavior, a gene and foraging or defense. I love it. I love it. All right. We're going to move on in the next lecture to talk about quantitative genetics. So I will stop here. That's a long enough event. Bye.